webinar, Medical Device Security, Risks and Remediation Against Exploited Weaknesses. I'm Beth Kolodny, the National Sales Manager from Wolters Kluwer. Joining me today is Lynn Reinheimer, who is the Manager of ComplyTrack Editors and Sales Engineers. For any questions today, please use the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar menu on the right side of your screen, as all lines have been placed on mute. An email with the survey and CEU info will be sent out to all attendees within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Brian Selfridge, who's our speaker today. Brian is Partner IT Risk Management at Remediation Services. He's an experienced healthcare information security leader with roots in Big Four security consulting. He has advised organizations on the development and execution of information security programs and specializes in identity and access management, IT strategy, web and application security, electronic health record security, and health information exchange services. Prior to joining Remediation, Brian served as the Chief Information Security Officer for an industry-leading healthcare provider, where he developed and implemented a strategic plan to safeguard the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of patient health information and systems. Brian holds a CISSP certification and is also certified by the NSA in Information Security and Information Assurance. Brian?
Great. Thank you, Beth. Thanks so much, and good afternoon to everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Looking forward to an exciting discussion about medical device security and sharing a little bit of insights in terms of what we're seeing out there across the spectrum of organizations that are grappling with this topic. Just a couple notes on my bio, and Beth, thanks for the overview. Methodology and our organization has, I think, kind of a unique perspective on this topic. From my own background, I started, as Beth mentioned, as a security officer kind of earlier in my career, and had a chance to kind of in the early days of this medical device security issues start grappling with kind of as devices become increasingly networked and connected and hooked back into electronic health records and everything else, understand how that plays into a security program and how we can start to get a handle on it with biomedical, clinical engineering, and others. So I've seen it from that side of the fence, which is the most challenging side of the fence, and also have had a chance to work with many organizations across the country that are assessing and building out medical device security programs. So I've had a chance to, fortunately, interface with some of the smartest minds and talents across the country, and much of what will be covered today is, as much as I'd like to take credit for it, is a culmination of what we've heard from others in the industry that have had some smart, intelligent, capable approaches for tackling this issue. So looking forward to sharing all that with you and helping you see some of the perspective that we've garnered over the years doing these assessments and these technical tests and hacking of medical devices and everything else. So just by way of introduction, or by way of agenda, I should say, want to cover this topic from a couple of different angles. We do have an hour and a half scheduled for the session, but we will take some time, quite a bit of time for questions. So I do encourage everyone on the line to queue up those questions as we get through the topics here. If there's things that you'd like to know about or that we don't weigh in on through the formal dialogue, we'd love to hear from you and get a chance to answer some of those here today. Should have plenty of time to do that. So the first part of the discussion, wanted to spend some energy just framing the topic a bit, giving a little bit of insight into the context behind why medical device and biomedical equipment is getting the attention it is from a security standpoint, and how that plays into the larger and broader themes that are happening with healthcare security and compliance overall, just to help connect some of the dots, as I'm sure those on the line are coming at this from a variety of perspectives, from providers to medical devices to biomedical folks, and everyone's got a little bit of a different angle. So looking forward to framing the context a little bit. From there, perhaps the more detailed portion of the conversation will then start diving into, what are some of the specific challenges that we're seeing, and why have we gotten to where we are with the different exposures and security vulnerabilities we're seeing on the medical device platforms. And then really looking to circle back the rest of the conversation around okay, so we frame the challenge, we understand perhaps that it's an issue, that there's these specific hurdles to jump over, but what are some of the leading organizations in the country doing to try to tackle this? What's been done, what works, what doesn't work? And as I mentioned earlier, as a former kind of security officer, my takeaway from these things is always I wanted to have something actionable that I could walk away from the conversation that I could kind of immediately apply back in my environment. So I'm hoping to drop some of those tidbits throughout the conversation and hopefully give you something that you can take back to your organization or to the organizations that you work with that are trying to address these. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to the questions that will come up from the group as we move forward. So we'd like to move into the front end of the conversation around industry context. First and foremost, I think it's important to level set and define what we mean by medical device. I think there's a lot of different definitions out there. There's a lot of different ways you can think of what constitutes a medical device or biomedical equipment. So first and foremost, we start with the definition of that the FDA provides the Food and Drug Administration. So any device that kind of has to go through that formal FDA validation process, certification process, and get 510K certified. So that typically includes devices that would range from kind of your small pumps, IV pumps, and monitors and insulin devices, all the way up to kind of much larger systems like the CyberKnife and these large cancer treatment multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. So it isn't necessarily the size of the device that we're so much concerned about in terms of referring to it as a medical device, but more what capabilities it has. And we make the distinction specifically of a networked medical device because from a security perspective, historically when these devices were originally kind of deployed years ago, they were very much standalone devices, things that had a specific function. They monitored your heart for EKG stuff, or they monitored your whatever, and then it stayed on the device. It got reported out, and it got put in the patient chart, right there on the spot by the care providers. As many of you are aware, I suspect, that trend has turned itself upside down over the last several years with the increased introduction of electronic medical records and other kind of interoperable platforms that allow now the data coming from these devices to be incorporated back into the electronic medical record and other care providing systems. So when we talk about medical devices in this context, we're mostly talking about networked medical devices, and that's where a lot of security exposure and security challenges have arisen once these devices have become network enabled. One other point to note about when we're defining medical devices that I think is sometimes forgotten about, at least on the outset. These devices very often have some kind of patient-facing component, a device, a probe, something that actually interfaces with the patient. But then very often there's also some supporting infrastructure behind that, whether it's a server, a workstation, some databases, things that kind of provide the middleware between the device and any other electronic health records or systems that need to get that data. And this is particularly important when we talk about securing these devices because quite often it's that middleware layer that's running, commercial off-the-shelf software like Microsoft's operating systems and other platforms that sometimes can introduce the security vulnerabilities and the configurations that are a bigger issue than the device itself. So we'll come back to that as a theme. But when we talk about medical devices, we're really looking at the whole ecosystem that supports the device and not just the actual piece of equipment that plugs into the patient, so to speak. So we come to this topic, and I suspect everybody's coming at it from perhaps different angles, but the reason medical device security has gained so much attention in recent years, I would say recent months, but really the last several years, this has been a crescendo of activity related to this is severalfold. One, I mentioned the network connectivity piece, and that's important. But we also have the value of healthcare data, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, is getting increasingly more valuable for cyber criminals and the bad guys out there. And they're recognizing that there is an opportunity via medical devices that typically have some of these common technical configuration weaknesses and challenges, things like default passwords, missing security patches that are outdated, remote access technologies that allow the vendors and other participants to kind of manage and care for the devices, and other areas that, again, we'll dive into, make it a relatively soft target compared to other components of even the healthcare ecosystem that would allow access to sensitive information. And given that that information is increasingly valuable, you have a perfect storm of opportunity for folks to obtain access to sensitive information and systems, not just through the medical devices, but to the other systems that are connected and networked behind the medical device, if you will, which is what the bad guys are often after, above and beyond just the device itself. So we're seeing that increased attention to the relative vulnerability and weakness of the platforms, as well as just a general, I think, very valid concern about patient safety implications. Now that these devices are networked, now that there's potential for adverse impact to the device itself or the platforms, you have a situation where I think for the first time in a real meaningful and tangible way, information security and compliance becomes a patient safety issue as a direct impact type of scenario. Of course, it always plays a related role. So you couple all that together, and I think there's a lot of good reason to be paying attention to medical device security, and we haven't even talked about regulatory stuff. We'll get to that. Of course, there's increased attention to protecting patient information in all of its forms, and certainly medical devices are included in that through regulatory action and activity there. So we'll cover all that and above, but it makes medical devices kind of a worthy topic of discussion. So I mentioned medical devices are a soft target, and I want to extrapolate that a little bit just to give you some of the data behind that. So we've seen a marked increase in medical identity fraud and breaches related to PHI, Protected Health Information, and medical data over the last several years, and we've seen this becoming a favored target for cyber criminals. And the most basic way I could explain this is, essentially a lot of folks think, like, why, if you're a bad guy and you want money, why don't you go after the banks or the credit cards and just go after the money and go exfiltrate it and use your security hacking techniques to do that? Certainly that's happening, and certainly that's going to continue to happen. However, there's been an acknowledgement that healthcare environments are fairly easier to go after, and also the data is much more valuable and portable. So a medical record has a lot more utility in the black market than just a patient's demographic information or social security number, for example, because it can be used for multiple different ways to monetize that data. So for instance, medical information can be used to obtain fraudulent health insurance and coverage. So it's much easier for me to obtain legitimate details of someone's insurance account, make a copy of the insurance cards, and allow individuals to buy those cards and then obtain free, quote-unquote, free services under the auspices of that legitimate insurance, and therefore, there's a direct monetary incentive to do that. You also have organizations and individuals that are taking medical identity information and looking for patients with particularly large sets of services and that are receiving prescription drugs and things for legitimate purposes, and we'll look to then take that information and then apply essentially to fill out prescriptions for narcotics and other things that can be directly sold on the black market. And again, that's a way that can be monetized very quickly and effectively in the marketplace. And so you end up with this combination of activity between medical identity fraud and prescription drugs, as well as regular identity theft, which is something we see. Folks that take out credit cards and other loans and things using that information is certainly still the case. And you end up with the value of a medical record is somewhere around 50 times, so $50 for a stolen medical record versus $1 for a stolen social security number or demographic type information. So that's plenty of incentive. The bad guys know this. They've been taking advantage of that. We've seen the uptick in breaches, which we'll talk a little bit about which is commensurate with that situation, and not surprising when you think about it. So I won't go into a ton of detail around the breach trends, other than because I think they're dominating the news sources these days. I think this group here probably has some insight into that. But I do want to point out a few key points about some of the breaches that we are seeing, particularly as it relates to medical devices and some of these attacks that we can expect to continue to see in the coming year and years to come. Many of the attacks that we're seeing are, we saw breaches historically the last 5-10 years that were predominantly focused on things like lost and devices, like lost laptops that were unencrypted, or USB flash drives that were unencrypted and lost. And certainly that's still happening. We're still having those incidents. Unfortunately, it's getting a little bit better, but those are still in play. However, there's been a major uptick in 2015 and into 2016, where a lot more of the volume of attacks are related to hacking and some human being, some actor that's actively trying to obtain access to a healthcare environment, healthcare information. And that's a little bit different than losing the device or leaving on the airplane or something. So coupled with that, above and beyond there just being more hacking going on, and that's cause for concern of itself, but the volume of records is just eclipsing the number of records that have been breached in prior years. It's this exponential curve that we're seeing in play, where the number of records that are breached, looking at Anthem and UCLA and some of these that are listed here, are the multi-million records range. And we also can validate this from, we do ethical hacking and penetration testing for organizations where we as Methodology pretend to be the bad guys, and we'll break in. And it's very common for us to get multi-million numbers of records in fairly short order, even within a day of attacking. Very often medical devices are our entry point into those environments, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we're seeing the number of breaches increase, the volume of records increase, and the amount of actual hacking and targeted activity increase. So all of that, I think, is cause for us to continue to pay attention to not only the medical device security issue, but any kind of proactive measures we can put in place to try to effectively stop the bleeding that we're seeing in the industry on this front. We would be remiss if we didn't spend some considerable time perhaps, talking about the patient safety implications of medical device security. For those that have worked in the compliance and security and privacy space for a while, we've always certainly had concerns, and we've had areas where we're worried about the impact that a security incident could have to our organization from a monetary perspective, from a financial perspective, from a reputational damage, if things are reported in the news, and the impact to our patient population, trust of our patient. There's all those things that are very, very important and have been on our radar. Patient safety at this level, at this kind of visceral level with medical devices, I think is taken to a new level with this issue. And that's a couple different flavors to this that I'd like to point out of how an insecure medical device or devices could pose imminent, immediate patient safety impact. One scenario, which is I think a little bit less likely, but perhaps a little more scary, is the targeted attack scenario, where you have we had a story that was out, I think, a couple of years ago with former Vice President Dick Cheney had a pacemaker, and he actually had it removed because there were some reports and some assessment done that it's possible to deliver a life-threatening jolt to these pacemakers, and that's certainly the case. And for a high-profile individual or individuals, there's certainly potential that somebody could use that vulnerability to intentionally cause physical harm to someone, and so that's certainly a possible scenario and something we want to keep an eye on. I think in the likelihood category, it's probably less likely that's going to be a widespread phenomenon. There may be some cases of it. What I worry more about is of these potential scenarios, personally, is the more indiscriminate attack against a medical device. So, for example, we know that medical devices are relatively less secure than some other components within the healthcare environment. So we know they're missing security patches. We know they have configurations that are often commonly exploited. And the issue with that is that computer viruses and malware are built to kind of prey upon that low-hanging fruit, those vulnerabilities that have been out in the industry for years, that everyone knows about, that could easily compromise the system, and that patches are available to address. But if there's systems that are unpatched and don't have the protections in place, it's that malware and those computer viruses that have the opportunity to take over those systems, and that could be something like ransomware, which we've seen a big uptick in recently, or just general run-of-the-mill computer viruses that are meant to steal information. So the scenario that worries me personally is not so much a hacker trying to, if I'm laying on the operating table, so to speak, not so much the hacker is going to break in right then and, mess up the device to hurt me somehow, but more that some indiscriminate virus is going to be able to enter the network or able to access these devices through either the internet or through the internal network, and then the unintended consequences and really, frankly, the unknown consequences of what that malware is going to do. If it starts locking up files and changing settings and doing whatever it's meant to do to steal information, I'm not sure I want to be the one on the table to figure out what potential impact that has to the medical device that's functioning behind it. So, it's a very real probability in those types of scenarios of there being some adverse issue. And there's been numerous studies done and researchers that have identified all kinds of potential scenarios. But I think that last one is the one that is most likely to play out. And we need to pay attention to protect patients' lives and well-being. So fortunately, this is not the first time we're talking about medical device security as an industry, and this has been a dialogue that's started for several years. And we're not there yet. We haven't fixed it. There's no silver bullet. However, there's been a lot of energy and attention around drafting regulations and standards and information that can help organizations tackle this issue. The problem is, the good news is there's a lot of standards. The problem is there's a lot of standards. So you have folks weighing in from the federal government with the FDA. NIST has some guidance out. We have executive orders from the president. We have, obviously HIPAA is always in play anywhere that you have to protect patient information. There could be some access to that, and configurations can be in place. So we have federal guidance, federal standards. We also have industry groups that have been pulled together and assembled around trying to tackle medical device security. So that's the Medical Device Information Security Group, the MDISS group. We have NHISAC, the national organization that's helping to coordinate cybersecurity for the healthcare chapter of that in particular. We have Joint Commission. We have MITRE is another industry-based organization. HIMSS has weighed in on this as well, and their MDS Squared initiative, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those flavors. But the challenge is there's a myriad of guidance out there. Some of it is super specific for very targeted purposes, like there's standards around here's how you assess a medical device vendor. If you're looking to purchase, like MDS Squared is an example of that. There's others that are focused on ensuring effective communication, like the FDA spent a lot of time just getting folks together to talk about this, and they issued some guidelines, but they're not necessarily particularly prescriptive. They're just kind of pretty high level, and let's all get together and talk about it. And so you end up with this kind of hodgepodge of guidance, and I think it's very difficult. If I'm sitting in the chair of having to build a program around medical device security to figure out, okay, which of these programs and platforms and groups should I get plugged into, which should I pay attention to? Certainly with limited bandwidth and time, you just can't do it all. Which frameworks are better and which are worse and that kind of thing. So I'll weigh in on that in a moment, but generally speaking, the context of the industry is it's a little bit all over the place. And I think we're headed in the right direction, but there's no silver bullet at the moment, and we're going to talk about ways to kind of coalesce all this into a meaningful way to tackle the problem shortly. So from there, I'd like to spend a little bit of time diving into the weeds a bit. So I apologize if we'll get a little bit technical in some of these next topics of where there are specific issues and challenges with medical devices, but want to just make sure we frame the various areas that we need to be concerned about in building security program around medical devices. So vulnerability management is probably front and center when you look at the exposures to these devices and platforms, and what we can do kind of most immediately and effectively to start to get a handle on that. So vulnerability management, so what I'm referred to by vulnerability management is essentially, every day there are new discovered weaknesses with products, with devices, with the platforms and operating systems like Microsoft and Linux and Unix and everything else, and other commercial off-the-shelf platforms. As those are identified, you need this constant rigor and process to be able to identify those issues, figure out which ones apply to our organization, our devices, and then get them patched or close those security holes as quickly as reasonably possible. Medical devices historically and the platforms have not done a very good job in that cycle and moving from identifying the vulnerabilities to patching them. And in many cases, we have servers and devices and platforms that are several years outdated in security. Patches, which is ages in the IT field. You miss a month sometime and you're behind and vulnerable to attack. You miss several years and you're in a world of hurt. And that's kind of what we're seeing with many of the devices. And as a result, we're seeing an increased kind of volume of computer viruses and malware kind of targeting, not necessarily targeting, but infecting these machines that haven't been updated. There's also some perception issues and related to what is allowed to be patched and not allowed to be patched. So for a long time, for several years, there was this kind of, I think, perceived sense in the industry that you're not allowed, if you're a provider, for example, you're not allowed to patch a medical device because the FDA places these quality control measures and validation requirements and paperwork and things around your ability to patch these devices, and therefore they were hands-off, and it's really up to the device manufacturer, and they should be the ones to patch it or work with the FDA to get validated. That was a perception. The FDA has been very vocal about this, saying, no. We do expect you to patch these devices. We do expect you to apply security patches. Now, of course, do that in a responsible way and make sure you're testing it and deploying it and checking on approved patches with the vendor and that kind of thing. So there's certainly some due diligence to be done as you apply those patches. However, it is still not only appropriate to place security patches on devices, but also it's expected. And the FDA has been great about vocalizing that, and I think it's still a perception that's lingering in the industry and still something that folks will kind of sit on their hands and say, well, I can't touch them, I'm not allowed. But that's shifting a little bit, but it's certainly been a barrier to securing the devices historically. Also, there's been a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blame game going on in the industry because there's so many different stakeholders that have a piece of the puzzle here. When you look at who's involved in securing devices, whether it's an IT department or it's a medical device manufacturer themselves, or biomedical and clinical engineering has some responsibility for deploying devices and purchasing them, making sure they have security stuff in place and patched. And there's just been, from our perspective, been a lot of finger pointing, saying that's not my job, someone else handles that. And the effective result of that is these devices aren't getting patched, and it's crystal clear that we're not achieving the outcome that we need to secure the devices. So we'll talk a little bit about some strategies to deal with that, but it's definitely a trend we've been seeing over the years. There's different flavors, just looking at some of the boxes here, there's different flavors of vulnerabilities and issues, just to frame that from a technical perspective. There are application vulnerabilities, so these are the things that have been developed and coded within the medical devices themselves. So the front-end interface and the way that the application runs to present data to the end user, and very often you have, as you do with any application that's been coded and developed, you have the potential for something to be missed or some security weakness to be created, or a configuration where there's a hard-coded password that never changes. So I think for everybody, those type of application vulnerabilities are very much prevalent, very much in play. And then we also have other issues that span across both applications and kind of operating system type issues, and some of that supporting infrastructure, where you have authentication, meaning the logins and usernames and passwords to your devices are either of a default value, or they never change, or they've been configured in such a way that you can't very easily change them. And once that becomes a known issue, it becomes very difficult to patch that if it's been baked into the system and built into the environment. You also have, in some cases, limited antivirus protections on medical devices and platforms, and sometimes that's for good reason. If there's, for instance, like a radiology device and system that stores large imaging files, sometimes you can't, if you run an antivirus program against the folders that store those images, and it can significantly slow down the performance of the machine, even sometimes cause it to stop functioning. So in the interest of making sure the system's working effectively, sometimes antivirus exceptions, either antivirus is not installed on some of these devices or there's exceptions to certain folders and things, but very often we're seeing that that's overly broadly applied, that concept, and therefore we end up with a lot of systems that are extremely vulnerable to virus attacks due to lack of antivirus protections, for example. And we talked about the patching quite a bit, but you know, again, Microsoft vulnerabilities, for example, that are released every month, if they're not getting applied, those are going to leave a continuing layer of security vulnerabilities out there. And then you have configuration vulnerabilities. This is more, you know, sometimes it's up to the folks that are deploying the tool, deploying the device, to set certain parameters on it. So in terms of ports and services from a technical perspective that are unnecessary and left open because there's some, you know, setting in the administrative interface that says, yeah, you can leave this on if you want, if you'd like to share all records with everybody, check this box, you know. And it's a bit extreme, but more likely there's things like access controls, overly broad access that's been defined, default settings, or easily guessable passwords where when you deploy it, you create, you know, username is the hospital name and the password is the hospital name. Like that type of stuff is very easily preventable from a configuration standpoint. We're still seeing a lot of that, and it's just another flavor of the issues that we have to grapple with. So we talked about the antivirus exceptions a little bit. We also have a challenge of just the sharing of information across stakeholders. So when medical device vulnerabilities are identified either by a medical device manufacturer or by a security researcher or through a penetration test or ethical hacking exercise, or sometimes how we come across these things, that's often communicated, you know, with the immediate customer, with the device manufacturer, but we're not doing a great job in the industry of sharing that information so that other customers and other folks that have deployed the same products and devices and technologies can actually take advantage of that and make those changes. So, for instance, if there's some easily changeable configuration setting or a password somewhere that you could change to something stronger, there's not necessarily a broadly disseminated notice that says, hey, you should consider changing this or that setting, and you'll increase the security of your environment that way. So, and that's also hampered sometimes by non-disclosure agreements and things that you know, it's not appropriate sometimes contractually to share this information, so that becomes a legal hurdle to making sure that this information gets out there. We also have a very significant challenge. There's a single bullet on here, but it's probably one of the most important ones if you take away nothing else, and that's around network controls and network segmentation. Historically, many hospitals, many healthcare providers have kind of, as these devices have become increasingly network protected, have just essentially kind of plugged them into the existing network and let them connect up and be able to talk back to whatever else is in the environment. But that creates, over time, now that we have all these medical devices and this internet of things, so to speak, all chattering to one another, the problem is once the bad guys and these bad actors can get access to a medical device, either through a virus or a program directly, that then becomes a gateway to the rest of the environment. So if your network is what we refer to as a flat network, where everything is configured just on this, able to talk to everything else, so your medical devices can speak to your primary databases for your electronic health record, and they can speak to your outpatient systems, and they can speak to your billing and administrative and finance systems. If it's all on that same network, then as a malicious actor, all I need to do is get access to one device, one system, and then that becomes a jumping off point, a launching point to attack and obtain access to the rest of the network. And I can tell you case after case with our own ethical hacking assessments where that is very commonly the case. Medical devices are often one of the first places we're able to get in through using known default credentials, through external web portals that allow us to use that and then gain access to the environment. So that's very much a real case. It's very common for us to in less than a day's time, go from exploiting vulnerability in the medical device to then having full administrative control of the healthcare environment, including electronic health record and other components. So that point is not to be missed, and the industry has not done a great job, although there's been a lot of movement in this in terms of segmenting off and quarantining essentially medical devices in their own network segments so that they may be able to speak with to the entire network. And that's the purpose of segmenting them out is twofold. One, you're protecting the devices themselves that are relatively insecure from attacks from the internet, attacks from other places on the network. If someone gets a compromised workstation with a computer virus, if the medical devices are segmented off, they won't be able to attack that device. But you're also protecting the rest of the environment from the medical devices. If you can imagine that, once a device becomes compromised, or the computer virus or a worm running on the medical device or the platform, that then becomes an active agent of the malicious actors to then attack other systems on your network. So segmenting these things off is important to protect the devices as well as other kind of systems nearby that could be attacked by the medical devices at some point if they become compromised. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about third-party reliance, and this is a challenge that we run into not just for medical devices, but with just the way the industry is trending toward moving large volumes of patient information and data and systems outside of the kind of historical data center within the hospital or within the provider, and moving it to cloud-hosted systems, third-party managed systems. So that's a trend generally, and that increases the reliance and dependence on those third parties to make sure that they're securing the platforms. I think with medical devices in particular, that situation plays out, but on steroids, because there's this super dependency on the third parties. Because very often, medical device vendors will not only be the ones to provide a product that may be secure and secure, at time of purchase, but they're also very often very actively involved in maintaining those systems, configuring those systems, swapping out those devices, and in conjunction with biomedical, clinical engineering, and IT. But so because of that dependency, you end up with having to rely on secure those platforms, make sure that they get patched. And medical device vendors generally, at least in the last year or two, maybe 3 years, have done a much better job of actually baking in security to new products that get rolled out and devices that get rolled out to the industry. And so that's a good thing, and we're trending in the right direction. However, many of these devices are meant to last years. Things are still put out to secure new products, but we have this whole slew of assets and devices that have been deployed that kind of make up the majority of our medical devices. A lot of times in the typical health system that are old, antiquated, haven't been patched, haven't been updated. So the security exposure is going to be there until we get a chance to work with the vendors and actually rectify the legacy systems that are out there. And they're running on, I say they've been running 10, 20 years. That's not an exaggeration. We see quite often medical devices and supporting platforms running on Windows 95, Windows 98, 2000, and that's pretty common. So here we are in 2016 trying to patch stuff that's been out there for 20 years, and that's a major challenge and major hurdle that we run into. We talked about the lack of accountability a bit in terms of all the different players being involved here. Hands to make sure the settings are still set right, or is it IT, or is it biomed, or is it, this is where you start getting into that blame game. And generally speaking, the industry has not done a great job of identifying that accountability and making sure it's crystal clear. So we'll come back to that and some ideas on what we can do about that. But then we're looking at the other technical security controls that vendors have introduced. Again, a lot of times through those legacy products, but things like lack of encryption and lack of wireless, up-to-date wireless protocols. So this is a quick anecdote. We've done these tests recently this year. We did an assessment of a healthcare provider for ethical hacking and trying to break in and see what we could get to. We were actually able to exploit one of the primary clinical network, which was running on an outdated wireless security protocol called WEP, WEP. You don't have to know that part of it necessarily, but because and they kept that environment around because one or more of the medical devices and products hadn't been updated to be able to support new encryption algorithms. So because they had this dependency, they left their clinical network using an antiquated and insecure wireless protocol, and we were able to, within minutes, from the parking lot, literally, obtain full access to the clinical network, and ultimately end up getting full access to the network from there, and everything else. So, that dependency just heightens the challenge that you have with relying on vendors that are kind of driving your security programs by their inability to keep up with the times for some of these legacy systems and devices. So we've alluded to this a bit, but this blame game, this governance and communication challenge around the different industry segments. So you can see that some of them listed here. We've got regulators that have a stake in what's going on here in terms of driving regulations toward what is appropriate, what needs to be secured. We've got professional industry groups coming together, researchers. You have patients that are in the mix here, of course. And it's everything we do is to support the patient, and they're ultimately the one connected to the device. So we've got a lot of folks in the ecosystem, and a general lack of coordination across those segments. So even if you're doing all the right things to coordinate internally within a provider, for example, if you've got biomed and IT and everyone's talking a good game, we still don't see that interaction with the rest of the industry to get consistency around working with the manufacturers, working with the industry groups, working with the regulators. And certainly there's been a lot of activity around this, but we need to continue that dialogue and get these groups together to come to a set of standards to move this forward. Okay, so we've highlighted the challenges, and I think we could go on and on, of course, about more specifics and examples of those, but I want to make sure we focus here on kind of what to do about it and what some of the leading practices are that we're seeing with many organizations out there trying to tackle this challenge. So first and foremost, we recommend, if you haven't done so already, align with one or more frameworks. I showed you that slide earlier that had the honeycomb with all those different frameworks. We don't recommend we haven't seen success of people that try to align with everything or try to say, yep, we're going to stay plugged in with these 20 or so different groups. That's just not feasible. It's not appropriate, and I don't think it's reasonable to do that. However, there are some better frameworks out there, and this is a continually evolving set of circumstances, so you have to kind of monitor the situation as well. But the FDA has guidelines, so at a minimum they're federal. They've got a say in this. They're doing a lot of energy around collecting thoughts from the industry and getting it coordinated. So at a minimum, get plugged into the FDA medical device framework and standards that they've put out there at this moment in time, but I expect those to continue to add value over time. The Medical Device Innovation, Safety, and Security Consortium, another acronym for your lives if you don't have that one in it yet, is another good industry group to stay plugged into, and they've put out some frameworks and guidance around specific parts of your components of your program that you should consider. Also have NIST, federal government's entity responsible for providing standards and technology, has the cybersecurity framework, of course, which has some overarching kind of security program domains and areas that are applicable here that I think make a lot of sense to apply. There's another NIST area that I didn't list here, but I think we're seeing a lot of organizations start to build their programs around, and that is NIST 839. NIST 839 is a risk management framework, and it's been around forever. It's the federal government's kind of guidance on how to assess, how to create a security framework, assess against that framework, and develop communication around that for any kind of information security problem you're trying to address. And so for medical devices, it's certainly appropriate. And we've seen organizations take the NIST 839 framework and then use that to apply some of these other programs like the FDA and the BISS and MDS squared is another one that has some good components. So the key is there's no silver bullet here, as I said. The key is to figure out which set of frameworks align with activities you already have in your environment, and maybe terminology and verbiage that are aligned with your overall information security program already. What you don't want to do is reinvent the wheel here. If you've got some other components where you assess risk of third parties or platforms or devices that are outside the medical device piece, try to align with those as much as you can. I think it helps to streamline the communication and the tracking with staying consistent with one or more handful of frameworks across the program, across the security program. There's another one listed here that I didn't mention, but I do want to point out, and that is the Veterans Administration actually put out a program called the Medical Device Protection Program. You can check it out. We have some links, I think, somewhere in the references in this slide deck. If not, I can get them to you. But they've got a great program that highlights a lot of the key areas for securing medical devices. It's very targeted. It's very simple but prescriptive, and I think the areas that they've outlined are an excellent kind of summary of the areas to pay attention to, which we'll continue to talk about here. So if you do nothing else, look to align with the framework and maybe even cobble together some elements of these frameworks, and then stay connected with them as they evolve over time, because these industry groups are changing and evolving and growing day by day, and it's important to take advantage of the work product that they're all putting out to benefit from, rather than having to recreate things yourself in your own organization. Another important factor and another important activity, if you haven't already done so, if you take nothing else away from this discussion, is getting an assessment of where you stand today. Much like any other security and compliance initiative, if you don't have a clear and qualified perspective on where your exposures are in terms of different elements of the medical device security program, whether it's vulnerability management or network protection controls or we'll talk about all the different areas, but until you look at them and apply it specifically to medical devices, it's very difficult to build a program that's effective that can be tailored to addressing your actual exposures. So we've seen most of the organizations that we've worked with to build out medical device security programs have started with an assessment of some sort and just getting a handle on where they stand. And that assessment may be a combination of interviews and looking at technical configurations, and then others will have gone as far as to do more technical testing like vulnerability scanning, ethical hacking tests, penetration tests. Now, of course, those tests are done with a special flavor of activities to make sure that patient safety is protected during all activities. So you want to make sure if you're going to do something like a penetration test or ethical hacking, make sure you identify a qualified firm that's done this, that understands the rules of the road, understands the steps that need to be taken to tread lightly where appropriate to make sure that adverse impact of testing is not does not occur. But generally speaking, get that assessment done, get some degree of corrective action identified around that. Make sure to get the appropriate parties at the table for that. So biomed, clinical engineering, IT at a minimum, as well as other stakeholders that may be appropriate to be aware of what's going on, and that can help get buy-in to investing in securing medical device platforms and devices over time. And then that becomes a cycle of continuing to assess over time and see how you can move those little dots on the diagram here up from the red and the yellow down into that green section, and understand how you stand against the rest of the industry with this challenge. So I mentioned getting biomed at the table for sure. You want to make sure that also training and awareness is conducted, not only your general, annual education, training and awareness activities where you blast out, all the HIPAA stuff, but targeted training and awareness to both IT and biomedical personnel to understand specifically what their role is with securing medical devices and platforms, what the potential exposures are, and very often these folks will have elevated access to the devices, either administrative access, or they'll be the ones responsible for setting the configuration, plugging them into the network. And so getting those parties some targeted training goes a long way to helping on the front lines of having your workforce understand how to secure the devices and platforms kind of right up front, as opposed to having to identify them in the assessment and have to go back and fix things later. So that's an area we certainly recommend if you haven't already looked into that. vendor security risk management becomes another crucial part of the puzzle. So I mentioned earlier about that dependency we have on medical device manufacturers to secure these devices. So if you're a provider, you want to make sure that much as you're likely doing for your other technology vendors, make sure that you have a process to vet the security of any new medical devices and platforms that are being introduced into the environment. So MDS squared is that group that I've mentioned a couple of times. That was a set of questions put out by HIMSS and some organization that pulled that together. So getting things like those questionnaires out and answered and evaluated prior to the contracting process, ideally, making sure that security is addressed so that you can compare apples to apples and look at different vendor offerings and know if one is securing things better than the other, and at least allow the business to make an informed decision around if they're introducing security risk as a result of the products they're purchasing. But then above and beyond just, it can't be a one-time assessment. As I mentioned, these things are deployed for years at a time. So you want to make sure you have a vendor due diligence process that continues to monitor and come back and check of the devices that you have in-house already, doing an inventory, understanding where they are, understanding the security controls of those legacy devices that are out there, and then continuing to monitor over time and assess them to understand which devices and which platforms pose increased risk over others, and put together some corrective action plans to get your patching done or interface with the vendor to fix configurations in the next upgrade, or swap out the devices in some cases is your only option for some of the true legacy stuff that just doesn't have an upgrade available and is more hard-coded from prior years. So leverage assessments, leverage questionnaires. If you don't have the workforce capability, a lot of times we run into that with organizations that have trouble just getting the arms and bodies and legs to assess these vendors. There are third parties, organizations that Meditology can get you connected to. We do some of this work ourselves that can allow you to kind of outsource that piece and as a managed service, and be able to assess your medical device vendors and then report back to you with which ones and which platforms and which devices are more of a problem than others, if that's something that would be helpful. When we talk about managing the third parties, it's more than just questionnaires and looking at the security controls, but also from a contractual standpoint. If you're not already doing this, it's not enough just to rely on a business associate agreement and say, okay, well, we got a business associate agreement with Philips or Siemens or the large medical device manufacturers are, but get in place a service level agreement, an SLA, that lays out clearly who does what and when. So, who's going to do the patching? What are the expectations around breach notification, for instance? What are the expectations around, and that is the associate agreement, but what's the expectations around antivirus? Who's going to be monitoring that? If this device gets infected, where does that alert go? Who manages it? Who reacts? Who's going to set the timeouts? I say timeouts, which are the inactivity settings that if you walk up to the device, does it show a lock screen, or is it just left open all the time? So it's important with some of these areas to identify not only the areas that there needs to be a discussion around this, which are listed here and which we've discussed throughout, but get them into a contractual agreement. And if nothing else, you at least have had that conversation internally of who's going to do this. I mentioned all that finger pointing. A lot of it's just because we haven't talked about it. We just assume that it's going to get done, and then it never gets done. So getting that down on paper is important. Getting the SLAs in place are important. And then holding accountability on all fronts and measuring and tracking with metrics and key performance indicators to understand whether or not these activities are happening is an important way to validate that that the vendors and the platforms are configured the way they should be. So we talked a lot about vulnerability management in the outset as being a problem. So let's talk about what are some of the ways we can handle it. Certainly ensure that vulnerability management scanning includes medical devices. And you may want to do a separate type of scanning, like a lighter flavor of the scanning that's a little less invasive if there's any concerns about adverse impact to medical devices. But we don't recommend keeping them totally out of scope because very often some of these configurations, like default passwords and things, can be picked up through a scan that would be it'd be easy to quickly go and rectify that. But unless you're doing a scan, unless you're including medical devices in those routine scans, those monthly scans, quarterly scans, then you're not going to see that, you're not going to know it, and it just is leaving a gaping hole that could be exploited. You want to make sure you define, above and beyond just the SLAs and the contract stuff, define specific procedures around each of these areas. Who's going to do patching? Is it, what are the time frames? How do the approvals get done? How do we test the patches against a subset of devices before we deploy it to the rest of the environment, for example? So having a plan, having a vulnerability management plan and procedures associated with that say step by step, here's what we're going to do. Here's who does it. Here's when they do it. And again, you can measure against that. Goes a long way to being able to secure the devices consistently, and not only for the devices you have in-house today, but also the ones that will continue to be introduced and networked as all this innovation happens over the coming months and years. We also recommend doing some form of incident response exercise, simulated exercise that includes medical device scenario, a medical device scenario. So what I mean by tabletop exercises or incident response is getting some of the players around the table, your biomed, your IT leadership, marketing and communications in some cases, get some of those stakeholders together and walk through a potential scenario wherein one of your medical devices that's not patched somehow becomes compromised, and just walk through the scenario of what could happen, how do we react to it, would we be able to detect that through the tools and processes we have today if there was a compromise? Would it go to the vendor or would it come to us? How would we know? How will we react? How will we communicate? And how do we effectively limit the impact of that so that if you have some malicious program or actor that compromises the device, you can quickly quarantine that and remediate it as opposed to letting it run wild for time being until you end up with a breach event. So those tabletop exercises, those simulations can go a long way to understanding very often where those gaps are in the communication process and the actual controls that we believe are in place or believe may be missing, and helping to socialize that. You also want to keep an eye on vendor security guidance around security. The medical device vendors have been putting a lot of energy, increased energy over the last several years on this topic, and so there's a lot of information out there from your key vendors. Look at your top 2 or 3 vendors as a starting point and say, let me get plugged into when they're announcing when a new patch is available, or which security patches are approved, or if there's a known configuration issue or something that's been identified. Get plugged into those forums, get plugged in with the vendor, know who to call when you have an issue, get a contact together to understand if you identify something on your own network or device, you can quickly call and say, is this something that we can help get resolved quickly and effectively, so that communication becomes important. And above and beyond working with your direct vendors, you also want to consider establishing touch points in the industry with some of these groups that we've mentioned. So MDISS would be a great one to get plugged into, NHISAC, that whole national initiative around protecting the healthcare sector. They've got a medical device component to that. The FDA and MITRE are other organizations that have collaborated to provide guidance. So again, you don't need a second day job around monitoring all this stuff, but at least figure out which of those groups are that you want to get plugged into, get on their distributions, join some of the meetings, and hopefully participate in contributing what you're seeing in your own organization to help tailor these frameworks to help them make sense for your environment and other environments. And then track corrective action and remediation over time. So I think there's sometimes an interest for these hot topic areas like medical device security or ransomware or other things to do a point-in-time assessment. Like, okay, we're going to look at medical device security. That's really hot, important right now. It is, but it needs to become a program. It needs to be something that is tracked and covered over time, even when it loses its luster as being a hot topic at the moment. And so it's important to, whatever action you take, don't just do an assessment today and remediate today. Do it again a year from now. Build in processes that you're constantly kind of running these vulnerability scans and understanding where your weaknesses are. And that's how a truly hardened security posture can be developed over time by creating repeatable processes and procedures and things where you have checks and balances to make sure that your security is covered over the course and duration of the product's life cycle. From a technical security standpoint, there's a lot of things that can be done immediately to address the problem. Look at, do a bit of an inventory if there's any default vendor login accounts and passwords that you're aware of or that you can query. Sometimes you won't find these until you do a penetration test or ethical hacking, but querying with the vendor and understanding, you can ask them some of this question: do you have any default support passwords that are used, where are they used, how are they used, and can we change them? And a quick anecdote for you, we've done a handful of assessments in the last couple months, ethical hacking assessments, where we actually use the same medical device username and password, which has been deployed to discover what's out of the network if you're looking for certain indicators, like the types of devices in the manufacturer, and start with trying to move those devices and those network areas into a segregated network to again, protect them from the rest of the environment. And then look at chipping away at that over time, either through a big exercise or resegmenting of the network overall, or perhaps even just something that you work on over the course of a year or two to start to get to a better place. But what's not a good idea is to sit and living on a flat network with these relatively insecure machines. That becomes just a ticking time bomb of either those devices becoming compromised and either hurting someone or supporting a breach event at some point. So that the segmentation is one of the more important things. It's one of the harder things to do in terms of level of effort, but it's one of the most important and most effective mechanisms to getting a handle on this. Also, for any internet-facing systems, so even if some devices have internet capabilities or hosted through, have web application portals and things that can be used for remote service, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but if you do deploy any kind of internet-facing devices and platforms, make sure that you incorporate them into a demilitarized zone or DMZ model where there's some layer of protection between that device, between the internet, that device, and the rest of the internal network, so that if the device or those components that are internet-facing do become compromised, the bad guys and the malware can't necessarily jump so easily to other systems in the environment. So that's a standard network architecture model. There's nothing too fancy about that. It's been around for a while, but we haven't seen medical devices really deployed using a DMZ model and where appropriate. So that's the type of conversation you have when you're purchasing the product. It's the type of question you ask with your technical folks when you're looking to acquire the platforms of whether or not they have internet-facing pieces and how can we secure that. The other piece is remote multi-factor authentication for remote access. This is huge. So in those cases where we were able to, from testing we've done, we're able to use those default passwords, usernames and passwords that are used to support devices. If there was a second factor authentication, like a text message that needed to go to the end user to validate with a set of codes that it's actually them logging in, if that were in place, then this attack would never work, and we wouldn't have been able to compromise as many networks as we have through our testing if there was that second factor authentication in place. And usually there's not a high volume of individuals that need to remote in to support these devices. It's not like you have your entire workforce accessing the medical device, but it's the vendor, maybe some IT folks. So deploying a second factor authentication for those individuals isn't a huge lift. It's not a huge expense. And with the technology out there now that's gotten a lot more capable, it's quick and easy to do these days. Can't speak enough about intrusion detection and networking. Make sure that you've got the capabilities to be able to monitor activity on your network. So making an assumption that, okay, these devices are really insecure, it's really hard to patch them, we're not going to get there right away. Do I have the capability to detect if one or more of my devices is compromised, and if there's any malicious activity coming to or from those devices, and even running some custom rules and monitoring around those devices to see what's coming and going. Now this is where if you do have a network segment in place, you do have the medical devices all in one single network segment, it becomes a lot easier to monitor them and know what's coming to and from those areas. So you don't necessarily have to have that in place, but it helps a lot. Otherwise, just monitoring traffic generally through the tools, IDS and IPS tools that are out there goes a long way. Also want to make sure to incorporate the logs from medical devices and servers behind the scenes supporting those devices into audit log aggregation tools and security incident event management tools. So for those that are technically inclined, you'll know what I mean by those, the SIM tools, that get those such that you can do that advanced analytics and detection of malicious activity through log aggregation tools that can compare the medical device logs with what's happening on the domain control or other areas of the environment at the database level. And you can start to see those attacks in more real time and be able to react to them. And then if you do nothing else, I laugh about this USB one. Quick anecdote, we had a vendor that kept getting infected with this computer worm, really nasty computer virus, and it kept spreading to that device and then to the rest of the network. And every time we came back, and these same devices were getting infected. Turns out the service person that to come in to service the devices was bringing an infected USB device. Every time he came, like every week literally, to service the device, he would plug his infected USB in and reinfect the system because it wasn't patched and it wasn't up to date. And so there's really not a whole lot of good reason to be using USB flash drive functionality for medical devices. If there is, it ought to be in an approved and controlled way. So look to implement restrictions for medical devices on USB devices. That actually goes a long way toward a lot of incidents that are happening out there. All right, I'll leave one last comment here. I'm going to leave some time for Lynn, who's going to walk us through some strategies around assessing, using kind of some tools to assess these platforms in your medical device program overall. But generally speaking, when you look at the medical device challenge and look to develop a program, it's got to address each element of the ecosystem. So there's activities that vendors need to be doing, medical device manufacturers. They need to be designing security in from day one, need to be providing patches and upgrades for legacy products, and continuing to assume that we're in the crosshairs of the attackers and look to put controls in place. For providers, it's the same story, but get that defense in-depth mindset that it's not just about passwords, it's not just about patching, it's not just about education awareness. You've got to be doing all these things to really have a robust and layered program, and that should all be boiled up into your risk management and medical device security risk management program plan. If you don't have a plan, you don't have a structure around it, it's unlikely this stuff will get done in a meaningful way. Continue to work with the regulators and government agencies to drive incentives and disincentives for securing these things, and become an agent in that discussion wherever you sit on whatever side of the table. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Lynn, and really looking forward to hearing a little bit about some of the ways that you can track from an assessment perspective when you do these, and then we'll open up for questions after that. So Lynn, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Brian. And for about the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce you to a Wolters Kluwer solution called Information Security Assessment Manager, or ISAM for short. And what we're doing with ISAM is we're providing organizations with a solution to assist you in assessing your IS risk across your enterprise, so being able to own that assessment process. And when you go through and you conduct assessments within ISAM, it gives you the ability to create and manage corrective action plans. It's going to allow you to work with an extensive amount of reporting within the system as well. And what we've done with ISAM is we've integrated into it the high trust framework and all of the standards that that framework encompasses. So things like HIPAA security, NIST, ISO, COBIT, PCI, Joint Commission, amongst others, while at the same time giving you the ability to supplement the content we're providing you with your own content, and being able to conduct these internal security risk assessments. All of the content in the system, and if I come into a sample control, all of the content within the system are closed-ended yes-no questions that you're going to be able to deploy to the appropriate individuals to answer. Respondents have the ability to include comments with their answers. They have the ability to attach supporting documentation with their answers. So having the evidence that you're doing the things that you're saying you're doing with these assessments tied right to it within the system. It's going to give you the ability to account for any threats that you're aware of in these different areas, vulnerabilities that you need to be able to manage. All of the content is tied back to the underlying regulatory material. So for the individuals that are answering the questions, providing them with a frame of reference so that they understand this is important. These standards speak to that, and being able to see that very clearly on the screen. There are risk ratings associated with all of the content that we have within the system, so you're going to be able to account for the likelihood of issues occurring. So likelihood is based on how the questions are being answered, the ability to identify an impact for your organization in these areas, and ultimately you will be assigned an overall risk score that you're then going to be able to report on, and based on that risk score determine if you need to create and need to be able to manage corrective action plans within the system. As far as that remediation piece goes, you're going to have the ability to determine for these areas that you've assessed, based on the risk, based on your own organizational views, are these areas that we need to remediate in? So if I come down to the bottom of the screen, I can decide, are we going to accept the risk? Are we going to remediate? Maybe we want to remediate, but we need to defer it for the time being, that you're going to be able to make those choices and to create and manage the corrective action plans within our system. And then ultimately, and what might be the most important element of all of this, being able to generate an extensive amount of reporting on everything that you're doing within the system. And you have a lot of choice within ISAM as far as how you want to be able to present and work with the assessment results and all of the information that's generating as you're going through and conducting these assessments within the system. There are very detailed reports. There are higher level, more oversight type of reports that you can work with in ISAM. There are text and data reports, and as you can see with some of the reports I have up on the screen right now, alternate approaches to be able to present the information, charts and heat maps, color-coded scorecard reporting, recognizing that if and when you need to present this information to your board or to other stakeholders, that you can present the information in a way where at a glance they're going to be able to understand what you're assessing and where your risk exists through the reporting. So that is our IS assessment tool. And if it's something that you would like more information about or you would like a detailed demonstration of, we will be in touch with you with our sales representatives. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth and to Brian to see if there are any questions that we can take for the remainder of our time today.
And thank you, Lynn. We do have some questions. Folks, I must tell you that we lost some when the system went down. So if you had something that you felt was urgent to ask, please ask it again. If we don't get to it today, somebody will get back to you with the answers in the next couple of days. But here's your first question, Brian. What are some simple first steps in starting a medical device security program?
Sure, that's an easy one. Thanks, and welcome. I'll try to rattle through the questions quickly. I think first and foremost, if you haven't done an assessment to know where you stand, it's very difficult to build a program. Assessments can be quick, they can be targeted, they don't need to be super expensive, but they can give you a lay of the land so you can start building a meaningful program. What you don't want to do is spend a lot of energy and spin your wheels trying to focus on one area that you think is the most important or something where you know there's issues, but there may be elements of the program that can be very quickly and effectively addressed and reduce a lot of the risk that you have in place, as opposed to spending too much energy in one area. So I'd say get the assessments done, either a general, quick, high-level assessment, or something more detailed if you're further along the process with something like an ethical hacking or penetration technical testing. But assess first and then build from there.
Oh, I'm sorry. How can we start the process with working with our medical device vendors to increase our level of security?
Great question. Great question. So the interface with the device manufacturers, it needs to be a partnership, like any other business relationship. And so one thing to avoid doing is getting into this finger pointing and kind of battle with your vendors to get through this. And sometimes it can be hard. It's a relationship like anything else. You need to have some give and take for sure. But start with it as a partnership relationship, which means look at your top handful of vendors as a starting point. Understand who the human beings are behind the scenes that you need to work with. Get to know them, work through, communicate your expectations around what your requirements are from a security standpoint, what your security policies are, and understanding how devices and platforms can align with that or can align with that or cannot align with that, and figure out where those gaps are so that you can track and work through them together over time and beginning to get the dialogue going forward. And then, I mentioned earlier about, get the assessments done, get the questionnaires out there so you can understand at the right level of detail how they're aligning or not aligning. get the contracts and SLAs in place so everybody's on the same page, get the procedures in place. And I think a lot of that helps drive the conversations going forward so it's clear who owns what, and you can have a more productive conversation rather than pointing at each other and saying, well, it's your job, no, it's your job, which doesn't work and which many organizations have tried. So if you're one of them, I can tell you it doesn't work. So again, just engage in a productive conversation and then go from there. Should be transparent about what you're seeing, your assessments, what you're trying to deal with, transparent about being open to how they can help or how you can help them. So that's how I'd recommend getting started with working with the vendors, and then it becomes an ongoing process from there.
Here's a great one. You may not have it handy at the moment, and that's part of the question, but they'd like to be able to point their medical device team to an FDA.gov webpage that states that the FDA expectation is that the medical devices are to be kept patched and updated. I think everyone's run into that challenge according to this question. Is that something you need to get back to them on, or can you answer it here?
Sure. I mean, with the link, I've got to get back to you. But if you look at the FDA's been working on the road, doing the road show for a couple of years now. So if you're not plugged into some of the industry consortium groups they have physical meetings where they get everybody together. They've done a bunch of those this year. They also have kind of the webinar version of that where everybody dials in. And the meeting minutes from that are available and accessible. We'll get some links out to the group after this where you can go to see them. But check those out, and you can see kind of the dialogue that the FDA's had and their perspective on this. They also have a couple of frameworks that they put out an interim set of guidelines, and they revised it earlier this year. So we could look to those as well. And it's more in the dialogue that you hear from the FDA about the patching, what the expectations are. So we'll look to those meeting minutes and things. But we'll get some links out to the group. And, you know, you got to be careful because there's a lot of information, and it's hard to digest them all, but it's in there. So we'll send those links and welcome any questions and point you in the right direction from there.
Great, thank you. How do we prioritize the devices that we should start with first?
Great question. They're all great questions. I guess I should assume that. In terms of prioritization, this is a tricky one. I think, you know, for organizations to tackle, I think you start with volume. You know, if you don't have an inventory together, look at procurement, look at the spend you have with your medical device vendors, or look at the volume of assets that you have from a GE or a Philips or whoever, and pick. I would start with the top two, just in terms of pure volume of what you have deployed out there. And try to get some semblance of that relationship and conversation going around the spectrum of devices that are deployed with that vendor, and then use that, either use one vendor or two vendors as a pilot to start to build your program, start to understand how you interface, what your control expectations are, what your policies are, and then once you have that defined, you have a plan defined, you have kind of a well-oiled process more or less with that vendor or vendors, then look to deploy that to the rest of the ecosystem, the rest of your environments out there. I think if you try to take it on all at once and you start having conversations with 100 vendors, it's going to choke on the bandwidth of being able to have a productive conversation and really dig as deep as you need to address the issues. So start small, pilot out, build your process, and then scale from there.
Our biomed engineering group resides outside of information technology. Do you have any suggestions on how the two groups might work together to better support and manage the security of clinical medical devices in use?
Definitely. So that's a common backdrop to this challenge is biomed historically has been outside of IT. A lot of times they're starting to report back into IT, so that's going to change. But either way, you need a relationship there, and we recommend a specific governance body, not that you want another committee and a meeting in your life, but at least a checkpoint where you get biomed, IT, compliance, and whoever else you think needs to be at the table to talk about, you know, here's our assessment, here's what we've done, here's where the issues are, here's what we need to do together to address that, and having that kind of, I'll call it kind of a dotted line relationship where you have a regular forum, you have some expectations on who does what, and you have a communication mechanism is most important as a starting point. It doesn't necessarily matter whether biomed reports to IT or not. You all have to come to the table and be willing to work on it together, and also getting leadership buy-in to establish such a committee, and understanding that framing the issue is important, so that you make sure that any work product coming out of those committees is put forward for funding and support and gets that funding and support so you can actually move forward effectively. So, that's standard governance 101, but I think certainly applies to the situation. And I wouldn't get us hung up on the reporting relationships. Just make sure that you have that body that can get everybody to the table and start working through it together.
Are vendors required to provide MDS2?
I don't think so. I think you can ask for it, and they certainly have standardized. MDS2 is that security survey that's sent to the manufacturers. Most manufacturers have completed an MDS squared, MDS2 form, so you can usually get it. I don't think there's a whole lot of pushback on that. It's a starting point, but it's not the only place you want to look. I don't believe it's required, to my knowledge. I think it's a standard that's been put out there and folks have adopted, but there's no federal mandate or anything that I'm aware of that requires it.
We have some more, so we're going to have to get back to people individually, as you say, because now they're flowing in. I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. The slides are posted, and you'll be getting your CEU survey as we discussed. Brian, thank you. Nerve Under Pressure, very great webinar. We thank everyone for sticking by us today.
Thanks, everybody. My pleasure.